Welcome you to our fourth speaker's corner that is titled Quarantine and its Malcontents, Lesson from the Ebola Epidemic. Before starting, we please ask you to mute your microphones. Thank you. As lots of you already know, this cycle of webinars is sponsored by the Italian Society for Applied Anthropology in cooperation with the Department of Political and Social Sciences at the University of Catania in Italy, where I work as professor of anthropology. Together with me, Lorenzo Dorsi, that you see here, and Luca Rimoldi and Irene Falconieri are the other organizers of this Speaker's Corner. And I would like to thank them for the tireless work they did to make this initiative alive, and for the care and commitment devoted to every webinar, and for the intellectual stimuli they continue to give in our teamwork. Really, as Society for Applied Anthropology, we are all grateful to them. Thank you. And let's also recall that this meeting is being recorded, and the video will be available on the Italian Society for Applied Anthropology YouTube page and website in a couple of days. During the webinar, Luca Rimoldi, that you see here in the room, will moderate the conversation and will collect your requests to speak and regulating questions and answers after our special guest has finished his talk. Of course, lots of the participants today already know us well, but for those who are participating for the first time, I have to say that the idea behind these open air internet conversations is to engage our listeners in debates on topic of common interest, sharing reflections, anthropological reflections about the current pandemic, and doing our best for making anthropological knowledge and applied expertise open to the public. In ongoing discussions with the Italian Society for Applied Anthropology, we agree that as anthropologists, we can utilize our knowledge, methods, and also our practices in the field to participate in the design and even in the implementation of effective and culturally mediated measures in response to the COVID-19 pandemic. However, in these times of crisis, our responsibility is also to listen and weave together local and global narratives about the pandemic and about the social, historical, and political articulation they inhabit. In practice, it's also time for us to pause and reflect and to interrogate how, like COVID-19, many past health crises have unearthed pre-existing structural inequalities, which are incorporated into local histories, cosmologies, and cultural attitudes. And it's precisely with this intent that today we have invited Umberto Pellecchia to recount to us his experience within Médecins Sans Frontières during the Ebola epidemic. Umberto holds a PhD in political anthropology at the University of Siena. And after more than 2 years of fieldwork in Ghana, he alternated during the previous period of research, teaching activities at the university, and collaborations with different non-governmental organizations, especially on issues connected with refugees, crisis, and social marginality. Until in 2012, I guess, he joined Médecins Sans Frontières as applied researcher, and he did lots of experiences also as anthropologist in different countries in South Sudan, Egypt, and Malawi, Liberia, and Belgium, and mainly on forced migrations and outbreaks and access to care. And he is currently in Brussels, in this doing a research consultancy for Médecins Sans Frontières and Doctors Without Borders as qualitative researcher advisor. And today Umberto will share with us his fieldwork experience during the Ebola virus epidemic in West Africa between 2014 and 2015, as I remember well. At that time, he was carrying out research within MSF, and starting from this applied experience, during this talk, he will focus on the development of the state-enforced quarantine in Liberia, and he will try to deconstruct its rationale within the global and local meanings of public health, and also he will try to describe its concrete reception at local level. Because what Umberto observed during the spread of this epidemic and the forced lockdown in Liberia was a persistent effort of resistance by local communities. As he will recount in a while, in interpreting these acts of resistance, he realized at the end that they were not motivated by an indifference towards virus spreading control measures, as imagined by institutional bodies and NGOs. At the opposite, these conflictual attitudes did translate into community-driven practices, and precisely aimed at containing the epidemic, but while keeping local networks of solidarity. One of the possible lessons learned from the Ebola quarantine, thus, is that institutional authorities, as well as non-governmental organizations, could benefit from including people's protective measures and solidarity-oriented reactions in response to the virus in forging their own regulation for controlling an epidemic. And this is why anthropology, applied anthropology in particular, could have a role in helping to better suit local needs and community-based protection measures and protocols. However, I have to add that as anthropologists, we are also well aware that the situatedness of individuals, families, and communities during a health crisis, and also the affective experience and even the localized narratives of an epidemic such as Ebola or COVID-19 are complex, culturally and politically complex, multiplicitous, and always they exceed expectations. Pseudo-egalitarian ideals, communitarian ideals, as well as genuine concern and empathy, solidarity, can be interlinked. So it's not easy to understand the difference between a presupposition of egalitarianism and the real, genuine concern about the other. And I like this complexity, and this is why I think any dualistic opposition, emphasizing in a sort of contraposition the difference between the virtuous community on the one side and the vicious state on the other side, this contraposition easily ends up breaking against the much more complex and less stereotypical flow of social life. Anthropological theories and ethnographic case studies also that analyze the distribution, the uneven distribution of risk and suffering are always needed. I'm sure they are always needed, and because this distribution is shaped by over-changing social political systems, by the dynamism of individual and collective attitudes, and by the vibrant deepness of our cultural and historical context. And I think that with this sensitiveness, I'm sure Umberto is going to present his interesting experience today that offers a good ground for comparisons with the current situation. So thanks very much to be here, Umberto, and to accept it to be our guest. And thank you also to everybody to come and to be here with us today. I leave the floor to Umberto. Our speaker's corner is yours.
Okay. Well, good afternoon, everybody, or good morning, good evening, according to the area you are now in the world. Well, it's me thanking you, Mara, and all the colleagues of the Italian Society of Applied Anthropology for this invitation. For me, it's really a pleasure to be a speaker today and to share with you my experience during the Ebola epidemic in West Africa. And also, I'm really happy because it's an opportunity for a non-academic anthropologist, a non-academic scholar, to share ideas with scholars of the academy or of other applied contexts. So I'm really looking forward for the discussions after my speech, and for the questions, and also for your thoughts. So as Mara, you were saying, you were introducing, I will share with you today some of the findings of my ethnographic experience in Liberia in 2014 and 2015 during the Ebola outbreak, as they could be interesting to use for a matter of comparison with perhaps the current situation of the COVID-19, or perhaps to reflect on the COVID-19 in light of precedent epidemics. I want to say that all in a sudden, the ethnography of the Ebola in Liberia became, in my mind, so actual currently, and it actually I used it in a way as a sort of compass to orient a lot of reflections that I had in the past months, as I think many of you, especially around the lockdown measures put in place to contain the spread of the virus, of the COVID-19. I've been asking myself a lot of questions. I reflected a lot on how these measures were implemented, managed. Sometimes, I confess, I felt uncomfortable on the way these measures were communicated or implemented. But then in the same time, I was feeling a sort of sense of civic responsibility towards the others, towards my beloved, or my community, my neighborhood, my city. So a sort of mixed feelings that took shape into questions, and perhaps I would like to start with sharing with you these questions, and see if those questions are also the ones that were in your mind. Of course, in general, the main question for me is if the containment measures that are implemented during an outbreak make sense in terms of efficiency to stop the spread of the virus. But in the same time, I asked myself if it's really true that there are only two poles of the possibilities of the containment measures. Just to recall these dualistic positions of your introduction, sometimes in the media, especially in the European media, there were two kind of measures, either the lockdown, the complete lockdown of the movements, staying at home, etc., or on the other hand, this is a supposedly nicer and softer herd immunity approach. And the media were picturing this as two oppositions without any gradients in the middle. So that was one question. Another question for me was around the citizens, the people, the communities, if you want. So if we as citizens, we decide to isolate ourselves, to even quarantine ourselves, to protect our families, our friends, are we necessarily falling into a sort of a blind loyalty to the institutions, a sort of voluntary servitude, and so forth? And in this sense, if we want to protect ourselves from the virus, be protected, does it mean that we are necessarily embodying the state of exception or the imposed crisis management of the states? Another question is, if we put in place forms of solidarity or mutual help or self-support, does that necessarily mean that we are reproducing the state-imposed altruism that was very well synthesized in the slogan of staying at home in many countries? Or maybe we are exercising a different kind of level of relationship or social relationship. So all these questions perhaps rotate around the concept of freedom. So are we losing our freedom when we comply to containment measures, or some of our freedoms? This is a bit interrogation. Now, I don't know if the ethnography can resolve, of course, all these questions that perhaps are a bit philosophical and theoretical. And also, comparing different epidemics can be a bit difficult because epidemics are historical facts that are historically situated, socially situated. And in what sense, I want to smooth a little bit the concept of lesson that I used for this seminar. But in the same time, I do think that an ethnographic mindset, an ethnographic approach can really help to grasp the complexity of the different levels, the different aspects that pertain a social fact as epidemic. And in particular, with the example of the Ebola outbreak, what I would like to show is that indeed the management of the containment measures as a form of govern, as a form of govern of the bodies, govern of the society, is in that sense a political space, and as such, it's dense of tensions, of hierarchical relationships that are at stake, but also of negotiations and of attempts to maneuver this political space according to the different, if you want, interests or capitals of the actors that are playing in this field. So normally, in the management of an epidemic, the state authorities, the institutional state authorities, the governments, they have the main power. They are the main actors at the center of these fields. What I think the ethnography can show or can bring to the surface is actually the role played by the non-state actors, non-institutional actors, the communities in that sense, as those that are supposedly being the beneficiaries of these containment measures, but most of the time acts as creators themselves of forms of protections, and sometimes, as Yumara were saying, resisting to the imposed measures for different reasons that perhaps I will try to share with you today. Saying that, I think I'm gonna share my screen now because I prepared presentation with some pictures. I don't know if you can see it myself. I can't.
Not yet. There is.
Okay. Let me try it again. I'm sharing. Okay, I think you can see it now.
Yeah, you can
okay.
full screen the PowerPoint. Thank you.
Yeah. Okay, so maybe I will start shortly with some contextual information about what is Ebola and the outbreaks. So, generally speaking, the Ebola virus disease is an hemorrhagic fever. It's composed by the family of 6 strains of different virus, 4 of which are those that impact mostly the humans. The virus is spread through body contacts and contacts of body fluids, either directly, so really touching the other person, or indirectly, for example, touching objects or things like this. The incubation period of the Ebola virus spans from 2 days up to 21 days, roughly, and it might bring symptoms from fever, aches, vomiting, up to symptoms that are a bit more severe, like hiccups, rashes, or bleeding. It's a very, very risky disease. The case fatality rate is pretty high. It's ranging from 25 to 90%, with an average of 50% according to the environmental conditions. However, although it's a very infectious disease, Ebola is to the opposite, quite little contagious, because in a sense it's a very fragile virus. Then when it's exposed outside its reservoir, becomes really really weak and can die quite easily. The first recorded outbreak of Ebola goes back to 1976 in Democratic Republic of Congo, in an area close to a river called Ebola, from which the virus takes the name. And ever since, every decades, more or less, until today, witnessed an outbreak of Ebola, mainly in the African continent. The 2014 and 2015 West Africa outbreak was quite unprecedented in terms of gravity and vastity of the cases. So the recorded cases were almost 29,000 across 3 countries, Sierra Leone, Guinea, and Liberia, and almost above 11,000 deaths, with a case fatality of 39%. The last outbreak is starting in 2018 again in Democratic Republic of Congo. It actually ended in March this year, paradoxically, when the COVID was starting in DRC, and really last news information of this morning, apparently in DRC, it's restarting again the Ebola. So I'm not entering too much into the causes or the roots of the virus spread, but what I would like to underline as a point that only tangentially I will touch today is how the zoonotic behavior of the virus. Zoonotic means that has its roots in animal reservoirs. It's very much connected to the exploitation of the environment, and this is very true in most of the, or I would say in all the outbreaks recorded. There's a lot of emerging studies that, interesting enough, are showing how all the life of the virus, so from the spillover to the onset and also to transmission human to human, are really connected to deforestation, to the extractive economy, to the poverty in general. Within this landscape, in West Africa too, the virus at one point spread from the forest to villages, even to urban settlements, and that was actually the first time in the history that the virus of Ebola spread in so many urban settlements. The only one recorded before was in Uganda in 2000. Now, say that, having said a bit this general information about Ebola and coming to the West African outbreak, the fact that it was unprecedented, the West African outbreak, it's also because, in a way, it had a very huge impact into the global imaginaries. Prior to that, Ebola was pretty much unknown, I would say, at least in the West. It was perhaps a bit famous because it was pictured in disaster movies in Hollywood, or it was part of conspiracy theories, or it was investigated as a possible weapon for biological wars. But in 2014, this kind of background of Ebola became a real component of how the outbreak was narrated, especially in the Western countries, because of course the fear was that the virus can spread across the African borders and arrive to the Western territories. The incredible international response that Ebola had in West Africa saw the mobilization of many types of actors that moved to these territories to provide support. All of them, they had specific interests, specific technological apparatus, and of course, specific moralities. So besides the national response sponsored by the WHO, there were also a lot of private actors, such as NGO like Médecins Sans Frontières, but also actors that were a bit more connotated, like the biosecurity department of the US Army, for example. So in this landscape, I thought that it was interesting to analyze the interplay between the different ways these different actors were producing the meanings about the epidemic. Because in a way, I believe that these imaginaries, these social imaginaries, lie at the background of the social behaviors of these institutions, and somehow they've also driven decision-making process that led to specific containment measures. So there are different actors, as I say, the global actors and the global understanding, the state, the NGOs, and then the communities. I'm going to give you some thoughts about each of these actors, but for me it's important to stress that it's really an interplay between imaginaries, so there is a fluidity between these different levels. The first level is the global one. As I was saying, a lot of the disaster movies imagination contributed to frame the narrative around Ebola, and alongside to this also a lot of global imaginaries about Africa and how the Africans live were the focus of the understanding of the epidemic, which basically meant, as one of the pictures shows there, a lot of focus on the non-human to human transmission of the virus. So a lot of emphasis on eating the bushmeat, the bats, the monkeys, or strange oddities of food habits of the African population. And this focus, this global focus, of course, overshadowed the real causes of the spread of the virus, such as the exploitation I was talking before, or the disenfranchisement of the public health systems in the three countries. Plus, it created the idea, the global idea, that the responsibility of the virus transmission was culturally driven, so the culture, or the individuals, actually, instead of a structural understanding. And then we go to the second level of these social imaginaries, which is the state, with all the apparatus, the government and the institutions. And this same culpability approach joined with a strong infantilization of their constituencies were at the core of the messages that the state was using and reproducing, which means that basically for the state, for the Liberian state, the unchanged traditions of the communities were at the cause of the virus spread. And somehow these traditions needed to change in order to stop the transmission. I want to quote you, for example, one of the passage of the speech of the president of Liberia at that time that says, quote, changing our habits and traditions, our cultural practices is a must in order to show that we can make it, because those cultural practices are the ones that are putting us in danger, end of quote. A practical example is that the first period of the epidemic, so August, September, a lot of communities were targeted just on the basis of their either cultural, social features. For example, the Muslim community in Monrovia was very much targeted because they were perceived to be stubborn in changing their funeral practices and therefore responsible of the spread of the epidemics, while actually they were very far from doing that, and they were actually showing changing of habits even before the imposition of the state. So the culture as a problem. The second level of the state imaginary was the massive use of the metaphor of war, the metaphor of murdering, that quite dangerously was used and reproduced in a context like Liberia and Sierra Leone, that just recently exited 20 years of civil war and 20 years of difficult relationship between state institutions and constituents. Finally, within, again, the level of the state imaginaries, there was this contradictory public health messaging that, from one hand, was urging the population to seek for treatment and care as much as possible, because Ebola is a real thing, is a real virus, it exists, but in the same time, using the metaphor of the war and the killing, so Ebola is a killer, we're creating a sort of paradoxical contradiction. The global level, the national level, and then the NGO and in general the organization level, at the beginning of the epidemic, somehow they were aligning themselves with this narrative of the state, like the one showed by these pictures, one of which I found particularly interesting for how it frames a supposedly important public health message. So the NGOs, at the beginning, they were aligning themselves with these imaginaries. Then, of course, during the time, changed and they created different nuances. But more or less, there was this assumption that the communities were out there not understanding what was going on, and they had to obey to the measures that were implemented. Finally, we arrived to the communities, and all these powerful forces were operating within their socio-cultural landscapes, and of course the communities, they were reinterpreting and reworking these social meanings and shaping them according to their history of inequality and of exploitation. In that sense, of course, the communities had a lot of theories about the virus, about a lot of imaginaries about that, a lot of semantics. It was used from conspiracy theories, if you want, to spiritual accusation or to witchcraft. The interesting thing is that all this plurality of local imaginaries, instead of being studied and used in a way to understand what was the feeling of the epidemic in the communities, were very quickly defined as rumors, and in that sense they had to be wiped away by public health messages. So in this interplay of imaginaries, the measures arrived and were implemented, and it came the quarantine. And if normally the quarantine is supposed to be basically a check for an individual who is exposed to a virus and to check if it becomes sick, during the West Africa Ebola outbreak, it was actually used quite indiscriminately as a way to block the epidemic and to block the spread of the virus. So entire villages, entire communities were quarantined, often on the basis of only few cases, and especially at the beginning, the quarantine was targeting allegedly supposed communities that were spreading the virus, like the Muslims, as I said before. So in a way, the quarantine was used as a severe lockdown and implemented through hierarchical approaches, very top-down, and very often without any basic support or explanation. The response of the communities to this was quite different and was changing over the time, but generally speaking, the reaction was quite negative, confrontative. It created a lot of mistrust towards the institution. However, also very common was that this mistrust didn't bring to a denial of the virus and a denial of the support that was needed. And interestingly enough, the communities created some creative responses to the epidemic. So I'm going now to show you 3 cases that for me are quite interesting. 2 of them from Monrovia and 1 from the countryside. And I will start with probably the most known for those of you who have followed a bit the happenings of the Ebola outbreak in Liberia. It's the case of an area of Monrovia called the West Point, which actually in 2014 became quite a breaking news in the newspapers, in the media at global level. So basically, West Point is one of the most complex areas of Monrovia. It's a sort of peninsula, as the picture shows, which is connected to the city with 2 bridges only. It's not a very large area. It's very crowded. It lacks some infrastructures. The population living there belongs from different ethnic belongings, and they are engaged in different kind of jobs, both formal and informal. So according to the institution, it was a dangerous area, and for that reason it was important to keep it under control, because that could be a potential viral bomb. And indeed, on the basis of that, what happened in August 2014 was that the institutions decided to quarantine the whole area with actual checkpoints at the exit and the entry of the neighborhoods. And the rationale behind that was we need to isolate a potential explosive neighborhood. But in actual fact, the cases of Ebola in that neighborhood were not many compared to other areas of Monrovia that was not quarantined. So the West Point population reacted quite soon to these imposed measures with the rioting, and the government was obliged to send the army and the anti-riots in order to keep this measure applied, while the local population organized themselves in groups of rebellion. They were claiming lack of food, lack of supply, and this dangerous interruption of the economic activities. So in my view, the West Point is a good example of how a public health intervention is a field of power dynamics in that sense. This attempt of creating a cordon sanitaire in such a brutal manner concluded with a failure of the quarantine itself. However, this failure didn't bring to a denial of the epidemic itself, and even didn't bring to a denial within the communities of the need of being protected. In actual fact, my interpretation of this riot is a claim from the population of West Point to participate in the management of the public health measures that were, in theory, also for their benefits. I visited the neighborhood just after the riots that are pictured in the photos of the presentation, and in fact, the situation that I witnessed was really quite different from what I heard before. I talked to many people, and I met different kind of actors in this neighborhood, and they actually showed me how even before the formal announcement of the government, a network of solidarity, of internal solidarities started to activate themselves in order to protect their members. And these solidarities were based on pre-existing network of solidarity, such as youth clubs or religious or church spaces, informal social centers of the informal workers of the neighborhoods. They were put in place self-protection for those members who were showing some symptoms. They were actually distributing amongst themselves the financial support that they had or that they received in a way to level down the possibility for one of their members to not work because of the disease. So basically, all these forms of self-protection were completely unknown at the eyes of the institution, because West Point, according to a moral category, was a slum, was a banlieue, and as such, it was a chaotic place. I would like to share with you the words of one of my informants, who quite cynically and ironically said at one point, so they decided to lock us inside, but they forgot that here we don't have any hospitals or clinics. So one of the paradox of the implementation of the quarantine. So West Point is a little bit of a if you want, an extreme case, but it's still quite emblematic of the tensions in the relationship when it pertains of controlling an epidemic. In general, in all the Monrovia neighborhoods, alongside the state-imposed quarantine and lockdowns, there were different forms of self-protection and self-isolation that were already starting. And whenever the state arrived with its apparatus and its imposition, the relationship between the local communities and the state actors became quite tense. Once again, these tensions were interpreted by the state institutions as form of denial, as a non-compliance, while from the community's point of view, it was a manifestation of a precise logic response. This response took different shapes, different forms, according to the areas of Monrovia. I think that I want to share with you some really of the common features. A first level of response of the communities was based on the fact that the main message that was given to them, and this also by some NGOs, was that when you show symptoms, go to the hospital as soon as possible. So a sort of centralization of the treatment. And indeed, when I arrived in Monrovia in September, in less than 1 month, in a city of 1 million inhabitants, almost 5 very big Ebola treatment centers were built by different actors, with the aim of admitting as many sick people as possible. However, as a matter of fact, the spontaneous access to this was very low due to the misinformation and due to these contradictory messages, and also the implementation of the quarantine and the lockdown. So these centers were at one point extremely busy and at one point extremely empty. What the NGOs didn't take into account was the social significance around these centers. Most of these centers were surrounded by tall walls that were avoiding basically the surrounding to have a look inside, to understand what was going on. And in some cases, quite sadly, the only thing that the communities could see was the smoke coming through, the smoke that was deriving from the burning of the hazardous material, like the one in the picture of the presentation. And they were seeing ambulances going inside with patients and ambulances going outside without patients. So a lot of people were wondering what was happening inside, and they were wondering, oh, but maybe they're burning bodies inside, because the only thing that they saw was the smoke. So the concept of trust, the concept of transparency and connection was really absent in that. A second aspect that was quite remarkable, and it's more connected to the response to the quarantine, was the fact that most of the communities, they actually refused the state-imposed quarantine, and they were much more compliant to informal, self-organized form of isolations that were actually led by groups in some neighborhoods were called the special task force, that were led by local leaders, both formal and informal leaders, sometimes youth leaders or religious leaders. And these form of isolations were locally managed, household by household. At times, specific members of the families in one household were put in charge of taking care of the sick people in order for the other members of family to go to work and to continue a sort of normality. Distribution of food was given, and a control of the transit in the neighborhood from foreigners was implemented. Information sessions were organized in churches, in social centers. And also, speaking about the political landscape, a lot of the local leaders were actually organizing themselves to publicly criticize the approach of the institutions and the states. Publicly they claimed the ownership of the control of the epidemic at the local level. A final aspect that I will just mention, but I cannot touch for brevity, was all connected to the funerary practices and to the burials that were completely banned by the state and by the institutions. But of course, in such context, they were still felt as more than necessary. And some communities, some neighborhoods in the city were actually proposing different ways of performing the funerals or performing the burial. That's only very late during the epidemic time span the state institutions were able to acknowledge. So in short, it took several months for the institutions to give credit to what was happening in the communities and to co-participate with them in the management of the outbreak. The final example that I would like to show you is in the countryside, so it's more a bit of a remote area. In a region called Grand Cape Mount, which is at the cross border between Liberia and Sierra Leone. So an area that is of course very fluid in terms of transit of people between the two countries, etc. And with this example, what I would like to underline is the importance of a decentralized approach to the public health, and how a decentralized approach can really help in assuring the compliance to the measurement. So Grand Cape Mount, I will show you a short, small map with a focus that I will explain to you later, is characterized by the huge impact of the extractive economy, mining especially, and timber as well. The mining industry, as a matter of fact, declined in the area after a quasi-complete reduction of the presence of the gold. So informal mining economy developed in the past years on the residual of the gold still available in the mines, mostly by local villagers unemployed after the foreign companies left. So being at the border with Sierra Leone, the area is indeed pretty much a transit area. And one of the first interventions that the state operated was indeed to close the borders, although the borders never were completely closed. There was always a passage of people. So the initial approach was to block the borders, but also to centralize the Ebola treatment to the main towns of the area by sending the mobile teams to local outbreaks deep in the villages or in the forest. The international NGOs were proposing, alongside this state approach, a giant deployment of supply for early treatment, and an organization of the treatment on a village basis. However, as the map shows with the green crosses, the villages were too many, and it was quite difficult to prioritize, also because the epidemic curves were very variable. In the case of the community I worked on, the community of Bangorma, where I conducted my field work and where MSF did some operation, what I thought was to using the ethnography of the local knowledge and the local practices, alongside with the epidemiological method. A little bit what Paul Richards say as the people's sciences in his experience in Sierra Leone. So my objective somehow was to understand the potential logic of the virus transmission and how to prevent the transmission, how to facilitate the implementation of a decentralized Ebola unit to support local initiatives. So you can see on the zoom that I made from the map with my handwritings that one of the first in-depth observations that I made was basically to understand the social, the logic of the social pathways. And for example, I wanted to understand how was the connection between the different villages of the area, what was their political dependency. They were all dependent from one village of many. What was the logic of the parenthood and the household logics, and it was quite interesting to see how different households were regrouped in a similar family, and they were working on a specific mine. It was interesting to understand the market direction. So, for example, to which kind of marketplace the villagers were going. And by studying this, I realized also that actually, despite the fact that it was a transit area with another country, the real potential of the transmission of the virus was rather not the trans-border transmission, but it was very local. So studying these social pathways was quite important as a prevention of the transmission, but also for contact tracing, for example, for surveillance, which are epidemiological methods quite used during an epidemic. Moreover, on parallel to this logic of the movements, outlining also the local initiatives already in place helped a lot to build a participative response. In that sense, what we learned, for example, was that local miners were organized in cooperative and represented at the local level in the villages with the local leaders. And this created a space of a discussion on how to quarantine themselves in case of an episode of Ebola, and how to assure a sort of continuity in the mining. along with the other villages, they were actually operating a support for the individuals that were isolated by providing a little bit like in the neighborhoods in Monrovia with food and supply, but also reorganizing themselves internally in order to reassure the continuity of the labor. In terms of local response, the local community care center, which is the one in blue on the presentation, was actually empowered instead of being replaced by a very big treatment center. The local structure actually was essential in terms of creating a sense of trust, because the local practitioners were having already the miners and the villagers in their treatment because of non-Ebola diseases, and actually they played a great role in keeping the continuity, the therapeutic continuity for the non-Ebola cases, and the miners, they suffer of a lot of diseases connected to their job. So empowering the local structure and actually providing, as in the picture on the right, which was the MSF base in that town, providing support in terms of trainings for infection control, for example, trainings on case management or supply, was the only intervention that the NGO decided to do, while the rest was organized by the local center. So I will end with this case, and I will just say a couple of conclusive remarks. I want to start by what you were saying on trying to be careful in picturing a dualistic approach in what we observe during such a complex scenario like an epidemic. So state versus communities, like again, two poles, while inside there are different nuances that I hope I showed to you. And of course, my point today was not to say that the state institutions are not understanding or are silly in a way, but what I would rather say is that in a way, as James Scott puts it, the institution, they observe according to their schemes and their narratives, the constituencies, which sometimes means to leave out the real practices. So in a way, my conclusions are quite obvious. The measures, the containment measures, needs to be socially inclusive. However, although this could be a truism for a social scientist, is not quite well understood still by a lot of institutions and a lot of actors that act in the response of epidemics and catastrophe. Although in the past decades, as some of the guests of the speaker corners that came before me, the concept of the concept of community engagement has become more and more a component of the public health narrative, of the protocols, of the preparedness plan. But in my experience, it seems that we are still at the beginning, and most of the time it remains the concept of community engagement a sort of buzzword rather than a real space of acknowledgement that there are tensions every time there is an epidemic, and perhaps a way to go through these tensions is to acknowledge, to give citizenship to citizens in a way, so to give a space to the communities to express themselves. In the West Africa Ebola outbreak, that was realized quite too late, unfortunately, by both the international and national agencies. And what they understood at the end was that perhaps by giving credit to the communities, the role of the institution could have been a sort of coordination amongst these different realities, providing supply, for example, providing a sort of framework, but in the same time giving the space to these practices. I want to conclude with a few words of an article that I recently read on African arguments, where, for me, quite interestingly, the authors said there is a tendency in the public health institutions, but also amongst the social scientists, to ignore the fact that those targeted by the emergency response also evaluate and assess the rationality of the public health measures. In this respect, the mistrust is not only rooted on traditional beliefs or conspiracy theories, but it is also formed by the citizens' assessment of the rationality of the emergency response. I hope that you enjoyed the presentation, and I'm really looking forward for your questions and your remarks. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Umberto. It was interesting. I really appreciated your effort to present different cases and different cases also that in their comparison could be really give us a clue of the complexity of the situation there. So thanks again. And also I like very much the fact that you were there as researcher and you could practice both your consultancy role and your anthropological role in the field. And I'm very much curious about your this particular position as applied anthropologist, let's say. And I hope this issue will come we can focalize the attention toward this issue in the debate. But before giving the floor to the others, I also would like to understand better your actual position with Doctors Without Borders in Brussels, because as far as I know, you are still working on contagious diseases, and I would like to understand better your role in Brussels and your role in Belgium, if you are conducting research on the current pandemic, and also if you can provide us insights about a possible experience as applied anthropologist in the current situation. If you had case studies to offer to the participants, and I think this can help us to also position the debate on the applied side of this presentation. And I'm also very much curious of the role of MSF in the current emergency, apart from your own position, but the general role of your organization in this emergency. So I propose you to start reacting to this input, and Luca will collect the request to contribute to the debate from the others, and all the others can send a private message if they want to ask a question, or if they want to propose a reflection on the presentation, and they can use the chat facility that is written right to, and you can write a request to Luca. So thanks again, and you can start replying to this first stimuli. Thank you.
Okay, thanks to you, to Mara, to bridging this experience in Ebola to the current situation. So starting a little bit about my role in Médecins Sans Frontières, I think I should start by saying a little bit more about Médecins Sans Frontières. It's of course very well known internationally as a medical humanitarian organization. The structure of MSF is quite complex in the sense that it's divided into different operational centers, so headquarters, and I personally work for the headquarters of Brussels. So it's Médecins Sans Frontières Operational Centers Brussels that has different areas under its coordination. So a little bit, as you said at the beginning, after my experience in the academy and in university research, I decided to join Médecins Sans Frontières in 2012 after different trajectories and engagement with different NGOs. And from 2012 until 2017, I worked mainly in the field with Médecins Sans Frontières, both as applied researcher, so anthropologist, but also with coordination and management positions, so project manager and things like this, which allowed in a way to allowed me to understand the organization better, and also to have a bit of a sort of potential role in the complex machine of a humanitarian organization. So currently, I work as a support position. I'm part of the research unit of Médecins Sans Frontières Belgium. So as you said, I'm based in Brussels, and my title, my qualification is a qualitative research advisor. So to put it simple, I will support those projects of MSF in the world that are keen or they feel the need to carry on an operational research, which means a research that is based on a scientific methodology and is aimed at being published in a scientific forum, but that has as a objective the one of being operationalized, so to produce a change either in the practices of the organization, for example, epidemic control could be an example, or in the policy when we go more to advocacy and to political lobbying. So operational research is not one of the objectives of MSF as such, but is a component, is a support. And in the last, I would say 5-6 years, the qualitative research with nuance of social sciences and anthropologists has started to be accepted, I want to say, and to be used more and more. This brings me to my current job. So basically, of course, now I'm mostly following COVID-19 related research projects, and I'm working now in coordinating a research project on the impact of the COVID-19 in the nursing homes in Brussels. It's a purely qualitative research, and the idea is to understand in the past 3 months how the residents of the nursing homes, but also the staff, the nursing staff, experienced the epidemic and what were the consequences of the epidemic. Well, the consequence of the management of the epidemic on the psychosocial needs of the residents. So the idea is to carry on qualitative research, and after this research to provide some recommendation to the coordinating agency at the national level of the nursing homes, but also to give a practical recommendation to the medical personnel into the nursing homes on how to better implement to make the measures being more aware of the needs of the residents. Generally speaking, there's a lot of interest currently in MSF to carry on research, but yeah, the coronavirus epidemic globally still has a lot of impacts. So the fact that in Europe we are entering in a second phase, the deep lockdown, doesn't mean that the epidemic has ended. Actually, in the context where MSF works the most, so in the southern part of the world, the epidemic is still running quite severely. And the point is that MSF is really engaged in all the projects MSF has in the world. So I would say roughly 45 to 50 countries. All the operations, all the normal, let's say, operations of MSF have been modified in order to respond to the COVID epidemic. I want, for example, to quote the South African case because it's one of those that with whom I'm starting a discussion for a research that is seeing a lot of difficulties for the patients affected by HIV who are in treatment of the HIV with antiretroviral drugs to be locked down because of the COVID, because they cannot physically go to the treatment centers in order to continue the antiretroviral drugs, which is essential for an HIV positive person. So this kind of dilemmas and this kind of critical situations we are seeing a little bit everywhere. I just want to conclude by saying that I think it's an interesting moment because MSF is traditionally perceived as the classic humanitarian organization that goes in remote countries and provides support, etc. But quite interestingly, we are working in Europe a lot. We have projects in Belgium, as I said, in France, in Italy, in Spain, if I'm not sure, but also in North America. in the US, and also in those countries that maybe are not Western countries, but still are countries that are supposed to be prepared, like in Brazil. MSF is present and is providing care for the populations that are less chance to access the public healthcare centers.
Thank you for the clarification, Umberto. Luca, do you want to give the floor to the first?
Yes, of course. Thank you, Umberto. So I leave the floor to Massimo Tomasoli.
Thank you very much, Mara and Luca, and thank you, Umberto, for your presentation. There are so many interesting things that would require further reflection, but I would like to add one element, which is how the crisis, the Ebola crisis, has been perceived on the global scene, and how different that is with respect to the COVID-19 crisis. And the most obvious example is the engagement of the Security Council in managing the crisis, including through field visits at the time, and the fact that now the Security Council is not even able to agree on a resolution on the COVID-19 crisis, on the ground that there is no agreement, that they are threatening the use of the veto power just to establish where the crisis originated, whether in China or somewhere else. So this is something that maybe you have also perceived in some way through your fieldwork. Part of the narrative is actually how it is seen on in the global media, and you are rightly saying that this pandemic now is perceived in a different manner also by those actors who are traditionally working in Africa or in other countries in outside of Europe, and now for this crisis actually they are engaged also in countries that should have had more strength in their reply to in their response to the crisis. The second element I wanted to stress is how you analyze organizations at the local level, grassroots organizations, and their response. I have spoken to representatives of international NGOs in India, for example, who said, like Oxfam, who say that they had repurposed some of their activities, shifting from political engagement action to service delivery action. And that was also a consequence of the weaknesses in state responses, especially in the field of nutrition, and reaching out to the most excluded segments of the population. And still, they are trying to analyze the political implications of these work at the service delivery level. So I wonder whether that is also something that you have analyzed in your ethnography. And finally, the point that you just made about MSF and the repurposing of international action of MSF through the lens of COVID-19. That is a common trend. We have seen it as a consequence of major crises in the past. There is a tendency to, being attracted by the last crisis, and the last crisis absorbs a lot of the attention, and actually also directs in a different way flows of resources. So how would you see that as something that could be either a challenge but also an opportunity, and what could anthropologists have to say in that respect, if they had to say anything? Thank you.
I think I will answer, if it's okay for you, Luca.
As you prefer, Umberto.
Okay.
You can answer the question.
Well, thank you very much, Massimo, for these remarks. They're also comments, I would say. Of course, it's a lot. It's a lot to say in general about the epidemic in West Africa, but also to answer your questions. What I didn't mention was the real beginning of the Ebola outbreak in West Africa, which was part of interesting discussions at the global level between the different organizations, so including the WHO and the UN, etc. And the main point was at which time we can declare a global health emergency. So that was a part of the discussion that, in a way, could be also analyzed through the concept of social imaginaries, because, of course, for many actors, the global emergency started with one case in December 2013. Actually, the first case of suspected, of course, Ebola was in 2013, and these actors who quite loudly asked for the declaration of global emergency were actually the one who also were already on the ground. So in a way, they were having a sort of understanding of the potential risk that these cases would have brought, which actually did in August 2014. And in August 2014 was actually when the WHO declared the global emergency. I would say pretty late, because that was really pretty late, and we can wonder. There have been a lot of colleagues in MSF, but also in other organizations who have even written things alike about that. That if the intervention could have started before, of course, we could have prevented the virus to spread in such a way. It's not, for me, it's not only a matter of timing, but again, and this is what I wanted to transmit a little bit with my speech today, is a matter of shape, like how the containment means, how the management of the epidemic could take place. At that time, I remember, in 2014, this concept of centralizing the care in big treatment centers was a sort of must. And in a way, criticizing, scrutinizing this kind of approach was being a bit out of the line. I don't hide that I was the one also put in scrutiny this kind of approach. And then I come a little bit to your second point. For me, it's interesting how at one point of the time, agencies, as you say, that have to shift from a political to service provision, because of the lack of the state and the institutions. It's very interesting, and the service provision is actually a political factor as much as the political services. So in a way, the international NGOs, by operating their choices, they were transmitting a sort of political choice. So the fact of using a centralized treatment center was, in a way, a political choice. It was transmitted as a service, right? So we provide this service, but it was a choice. How conscious was that choice? This can be a matter of debate. In a way, I really believe that the public health mindset that is behind choosing a different containment measures or another is political itself as well. And it's political in the sense that it perceives the patients or the intervention according to specific notions, category, or imaginaries, as I try to say, and in that sense is political. The last point is really, as you said, about the international action and the international agency and what the anthropologist can do. It's very difficult to answer these questions, and maybe I at the cost of being autobiographical, sorry for that, but what I think is that the anthropologists, they can do a lot of things, and they can do a lot of things by being aware of being part of a multidisciplinary team. if you recollect in the example, in the third example that I quoted, the one of the countrysides, this idea of using Paul Richards' approach to in Sierra Leone of the social pathways, but was stimulated by my epidemiological colleagues and their need of understanding how better put in place a surveillance system that is socially and culturally sounded. So the integration of this mindset, the anthropological, the social sciences, and the epidemiological, the biomedical, if you want, together really created an interesting approach. And this is very practical. So I was there to, in a way, trying to provide very practical answers, but a little bit, as you were saying, Massimo, all these services, they have also a political meaning. And what I want to believe is that by creating a more inclusive and decentralized approach, we also attempted to spread a message at more political and conceptual level, saying perhaps we should evaluate a different approach to the epidemic.
Thank you, Umberto. I leave the floor to Irene Falconieri.
Thank you, Luca. Thank you, Umberto, for a very interesting presentation. I have a short question. So, in Italy, often media report on the management of COVID-19 pandemic in Western countries and in some cases in Latin America. On the media level, little or nothing is now about how the COVID-19 epidemic is managed in many countries of global South. This is definitely something that deals with global inequalities. In your opinion, how can local communities take the floor to speak both with local institutions and to have a global voice? Thank you.
Thank you for your question, Irene. I share with you the same observation that in the global media, what is happening in the non-Western countries really left apart. It was the same situation at the beginning of the Ebola outbreak, maybe in a different way, because they were talking about Africa, but they were talking about Africa because of the fear the Western countries had about Ebola. So now there is a virus, there is a pandemic, so a global epidemic everywhere, but we are not even talking about that at our level. However, in those countries and in those regions of the global South, so it can be Africa or South America or Asia, different actors, they do talk about COVID with the different levels, practical level, but also political level. And there's actually a lot of comparisons that have been discussed between Ebola and COVID. So I quoted at the end of my speech the African argument authors. They were all African intellectuals and scholars that were, for me, in a very simple way, saying, sorry to simplify the thought, but let's not think that the African communities, they interpret whatever is happening only according to beliefs, traditions, etc. They're also saying, what are you state doing to us as constituencies? And what we are saying is likewise logical and rational. So there is actually a debate on the global South. This is not taken into account much within the global media. And I agree with you, it's because of the global inequalities that are still framing the discourse in a way, and are still probably framing the the population of the global south as purely and only beneficiaries of an intervention and not actors co-participating in any kind of intervention. This is a debate, for example, that in Médecins Sans Frontières is very, very actual. After decades of a very centralized Western, white, I want to say, approach to the humanitarian interventions, it's very at the core of the mission of MSF, this more decentralized approach in terms of operational mindset, but also to decolonize, if I can use this terminology that is, I'm aware, a bit strong, especially with an audience of social scientists, decolonize the humanitarian mindset that is behind the principles that drive the operations. So it's a way to acknowledge that actually the populations that are always being framed as populations, so as beneficiaries, they are actually actors. And in the Ebola outbreak in Democratic Republic of Congo, this is very visible. Like the terminology of rumors, like this morality of the rumor that is normally used by the international organizations was very little present in the past 2 years in order to interpret what the communities were saying or the significance of the epidemic itself. It was much more acknowledged the fact that, for example, the accusation of witchcraft could be used as a way to understand where are the polarities of the power in such communities. And through this understanding of the polarity of the powers, seeing how we can organize, we, international organization, coming in this field of power, our intervention. Of course, we are quite far from having a complete egalitarian approach, but a little bit as Mara was saying in the introduction, and I share with her this approach to see, like complete egalitarian framework or a very hierarchical. I think it's a very hard to find. It's in the gradation that are in between that I think there is something interesting.
Thank you, Umberto. Thank you, Irene. I leave the floor to Aurora.
Hello, good evening, everyone. Thank you, Luca, for giving me the floor. And thank you, Umberto, for this very rich presentation, for the discussion that we are enjoying now. You raised many interesting points, but I just would like to raise one question to give space to the other. In your presentation, you told us that the strong dichotomy between, from the one hand, the state which imposes on its citizens forced quarantine and to perpetuate its biopower, and on the other hand, the voices of grassroots movements that search for practices of resistance and alternative and more effective practices for control the epidemic and the virus. This dichotomy is too strong, is too hard, that in fact things are more nuanced, more mixed. So I would like to ask you if you could elaborate more on this point and tell us if maybe there are within the population also voices that support state decisions if they were crisis or fight, or also different critical voices within the grassroots movements, how they cope with each other and so on. Thank you.
Thank you for your question, Aurora. Of course, if I could have the opportunity, I would talk for much more time, but I will, sorry, I will try to be a bit synthetic. So indeed, I think that there's a lot of nuances. So the three cases that I presented wanted to more or less provide this kind of variety. One reflection that I have is when we talk about this dichotomy between states and communities, that's perhaps we should be careful in falling into the trap of thinking the state and the institutions of the state and this is, I'm saying this also for myself as a self-criticism, as either the army or the police or the government or the ministries. For example, the third case I presented, the one in the countryside, the public, the small clinic in the village was a public public clinic. So it was part of the ramification of the Ministry of Health, so basically the state. There it worked quite smoothly, the collaboration between a state institutions, in that case a small clinic, an NGO, and the populations. For the reasons that I try to explain, for a repositioning and a relativization of the power position of the different actors. So that the clinic itself was very keen to acknowledge the existing practices of the villagers and the miners. Actually, they were, the nurses themselves were giving us, a team on the ground, a lot of information on how the miners are organized. And they were actually those who were saying, okay, there is Ebola, but these people suffer of chronic diseases that we cannot interrupt. So that's, for example, a level of mutual understanding that I think it was very successful, unlike in the neighborhoods in Monrovia, where actually the confront was very strong, and the West Point case, where it was really violence in that sense, rioting, reaching the peak of this dichotomy that we said. Also, perhaps because of historical reasons, that could be interesting to investigate. But yes, in the urban settlements, the relationship with the state measures was much more severe and much more confrontational. And in a way, I think it was interesting to analyze and to interpret this rioting a little bit, as I tried to transmit, not as a rebellion per se, but as a way of claiming the public space and the position in the public space for the epidemic control. At least this is what I felt by interviewing and by collecting the point of view of the inhabitants in West Point. I hope to have answered your question.
Grazie Aurora, grazie Umberto. I leave the floor to Lorenzo Dorsi.
Thank you, Luca. Hi again, Umberto. Well, my question is, I mean, in your discussion today, and also in the article that you publish on Anthropology in Action, I mean, you read the level of irrationality and contradictions that is hidden in the authorities' decision. I'm thinking, for example, no, you told us about the decision to leave open private clinics and to ban traditional burials when quantitative data demonstrate that the latter did not provoke a serious cluster of contagion. So you read this level of irrationality and contradiction as a form of state control and as a form of biopower, which aim to perpetuate state power. I'm wondering why you did not also use I mean, if you didn't find interesting this case as to be read in the lens of the moral construction of risk, and through the literature of anthropology of risk, fear, and damage. For example, I'm thinking about in Italy now the case of the runners during the quarantine, during the lockdown. No, I mean, you were in Belgium, but here, for example, no, the runners were on the media, on the local I mean, in the speech of media, local administrators, common sense. They were identified really as the agent carrying the evil, no? And implicitly or explicitly, they were blamed of individualism, because by not giving up their training, they threatened the common good. So there was a sort of runner hunt, let's say. But I think that, for example, this runner hunt show us how also in the rational West, risk management is really linked to the moral construction of the image and through which the social body is ordered. So my question is, if you find that this lens can be also used for your cases of Ebola in Liberia.
Thank you, Lorenzo. Yes, indeed. I think it's very pertinent what you said, and I really see actually in strong connection with perhaps the first part of the presentation on the social imaginaries and how this way of signification were elaborated and re-elaborated locally. I would have loved to spend a bit more time talking about that, but indeed the construction of the risk and of the fear, I will say, also the social construction of the fear, it's very much at stake when, and this is a bit my interest, when a decision-making process starts with the aim of deciding, okay, what we have to do to intervene in the public health sphere. It's very interesting in the case of the runners that I would assimilate somehow to the case of the Muslim communities in Monrovia that were targeted since the beginning as the one perpetrating the virus. And actually, even at the end of the 10 months of the epidemic in West Africa, although they showed a lot of their changing of their habits, etc., even through newspapers. I have a collection of articles that show that they keep being referred as those in charge, those carrying the virus. Now, I don't know how to interpret the runner in our context. In that context, I think that really the historical hierarchies played a lot of a role on how certain part of the population were used in this construction of the fear and on the risk. With the runners, I see a bit of a paradox, because I don't know if you share the same, but the runner is a sort of a metaphor of the individual freedom of me using my body to do whatever I want and to seek for freedom, etc., which is in a way a morality of the West, right? The individual freedom. And paradoxically, this individual freedom of the runner has been targeted as the one shedding the risk of the virus. So in a way, I think that to sum up, the moral construction of the risk and the fear are at stake in the epidemic, and are at stake also in driving the decisions of the institutions and how the individuals of the communities perceive it. So indeed, I think it's a very interesting point.
Thank you.
Thank you, Lorenzo. Thank you, Umberto. I have a question for you, Umberto, if I can. So, and I will quote the article you published on Anthropology in Action too, as Lorenzo did, because in this article you claim that you did not use the participant observation as research method due to quarantine restriction, of course. So I'd like you to say something about the methodology you used to collect your ethnographic data. The first part of the question, and the second is do you think that today, after or during this COVID-19 pandemic, Western anthropology could have difficulties in engaging a relationship with interlocutor during field work? I mean, if for Ebola the health or research staff of the NGO could be perceived as an ally in dealing with the pandemic, do you think that today they could be perceived, or we could be perceived as Western anthropologists as vectors of the disease by local communities? Thank you.
Okay, well, thank you, Luca. It's a very dense question, because, yeah, but it makes a lot of sense to ask about the methods how to do research during an epidemic is, if I can use it a bit as a slogan. It's true that I did mention in the article that I didn't carry on a participant observation, in the sense that, well, my fieldwork was pretty short if we compare with, let's say, the traditional fieldwork that a scholar during the PhD, mostly, because then after PhD maybe there's not much time, but does. So I spent in 2014 2 months in Delft, and then in 2015 more or less the same, but I was really moving a lot between Monrovia, the neighborhood of Monrovia, the countryside. So I did not carry on a full participant observation in the areas. What I carried on was indeed an observation of the practices, in the sense that I spent time with most of the interlocutor. However, the method, if you want, that I privileged was the interview or the dialogue, and these interviews were not at all framed with a deadline in terms of time, but I was really spending a lot with my interlocutors. And sometimes it was also collective, like different kind of interlocutors that were actually discussing among themselves, and I was actually invited to some of the meetings. For example, I mentioned the youth associations in Monrovia who were self-managing some isolation or quarantine, where I was invited to observe their meetings and to understand a little bit what was at stake in their discussions. Those, of course, within a framework of security and safety that was always challenging. And in this, I go to the second part of your question. I have to say that I feel myself a sort of privileged position in having been during an epidemic in the front line. Sorry for using a war metaphor. In that sense, because I was there within an organization that allowed me to be in the field. And I think that what is difficult now for most of the scholars is the access to the field, and the relationship that needs to be there, nevertheless, with the participants, to the research, to the responders, to the communities. Always as anthropologists, always as researchers, we are perceived according to the local moralities. And I do think that in some contexts, yes, we could be into the dangerous position of being perceived as vectors of the disease. And it was the same during the Ebola. So now the game, if you allow me this term, is how to negotiate this position with the persons who are keen to share with a researcher. In Ebola, it was possible by spending really a lot of time explaining who I was, because there were many layers of my symbolic position, besides the fact of being potentially somebody who was bringing the virus inside. I was also the one who was assimilated to a medical organization. So was assimilated to an organization that was there to help, not to ask questions. So in the negotiation, in the reflexivity that normally the anthropologists are supposed to do in the field with their interlocutors, I think it's key, the fact of doing research during an epidemic. I think it's more difficult to the access in that sense with the field. And in a way, and in this I recollect a little bit what also again Mara was saying at the beginning, sometimes the question that I think we need to ask ourselves is when it's relevant for us social scientists, anthropologists, to start making research during an epidemic, because perhaps it's also necessary a moment of distance from the things to happen in order to acquire the familiarity with the epidemic itself, and also in a way not to run the risk of being trapped into perhaps experiences of before that could be also the Ebola, for example, or theoretical frameworks that maybe might not work the moment we go in the field. So maybe I went a bit beyond with my answer to your point, but I hope I answered.
We have, I think, a final question, so I leave the floor to Claudia Mattalucci.
Okay, thank you for your wonderful presentation. I cannot make it with the camera, but anyway, you hear me. So I have a question. I don't know if you work on that, but I wonder if you can tell us something about the management of the dead during the Ebola pandemic, if you have done ethnographic research on that, because I think it could be very interesting in comparative terms with the effect of COVID-19 in Italy, at least. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Claudia. Well, it's a very big topic, very big chapter of my experience in Ebola. As I said, unfortunately, I didn't share much today because I focused more on the containment measures, and I actually didn't publish also much about the funerals. But it's a very big topic because it really shows the interplay of socio-cultural dimensions and the political one, how institutional actors perceive the funerals, which in most of the case is perceived as purely, I don't know how to say, management of the body, in the sense of it's dead, needs to be buried or cremated, etc. While, as we know, and I'm saying something quite obvious for the audience, in most of the contexts where we work, or in all the contexts where we work, funerals, they have dimensions that go way beyond a biomedical one. In those contexts, for example, as in many African contexts, the funerals are not only ceremonies of passage or rituals, but are also contexts where succession on power are negotiated, heritage, the land, tenure. So it's a very dense and complex. So what happened shortly was that at the beginning, from August to almost November, quite tragically, quite sadly, most of the dead bodies were cremated, without allowing the population to access, to witness even the death of their beloved. It was tragic, and it was also a component, and I would like to say a structural component on parallel to the top-down quarantine, of the mistrust amongst the communities. What was the rationale behind that? The public health rationale behind that was, we don't have time, and there are way too many bodies, too many dead bodies, so we need to intervene with a very logical and rational approach. So I recollect in my mind the image of the military trucks in the city of Bergamo or Brescia in the north of Italy, carrying out of the city the coffins of the death, because there were way too many. So this quantitative logic, right? The problem is that this quantitative logic, this quantitative rationality really clashed with the misinformation and the access to the needs of the communities. And it took, during the Ebola outbreak, really long time in order to change that practice. Another level I just mentioned quite quickly during the presentation was the perception that the communities in Liberia and in West Africa in general were using unsafe, unsanitary practices during the funerals, and therefore these practices needed to be blocked by the state. Well, amongst the many paradoxes of the epidemic in West Africa was the fact that actually the communities were already changing their habits way before the state asked them to do that, like the Muslim communities. But another paradox was that the cemeteries were completely closed in Monrovia, for example, but the funeral homes, which are like the places where the bodies are emballed and put in a coffin, were open. Why? Because the funeral homes were mostly accessed by high class, upper class components of the Monrovian society, while the cemeteries, the normal cemeteries, no. So hierarchies and political powers playing a role also on that.
Thank you, Umberto. I think the webinar is over, and we thanks again all of you. The discussion was fascinating, and I hope we will have future possibility and opportunities to interact and continue this debate. I also would like to propose you to come to us again after summer to recount a bit more about your current research. I think it's very important, and we have a national conference, Society for Applied Anthropology, in December. So I hope to have the opportunity to invite you again to present your things. And let's just recall that the webinar has been recorded, as you know, and will be available, so everybody can see, they can watch these webinars on the YouTube page and Facebook page of our association. Thanks again to all of you, and see you soon.
Thank you very much.